I would like to introduce another Carey School alumni, Jean Pyrah, and her Panther Points of Pride video.
Hi, I'm Jean Pyrah. I graduated from Carey High School in 1938. I lived in, my aunt was the postmistress, and they had a room in the back of the post office, and that's where she lived, and that's where I lived with her. And I used to walk to school from there. It's where the tin storage unit is in Adamson's now. It's that right there. It was a two-story cement building at that time, and there was a room upstairs, but it was never used for much of anything. Well, I had a lot of memories. One thing I remember, I could stand in the one south window and watch the kids from South Carey come to school in a sleigh. And they had a heater in it, a wood-burning stove, and the kids would come up. And I'd always be to school by then, and I could watch them come out. I thought that was kind of a cool way to come to school. And I was there at the time that they brought all those buildings in from the other schools. And we had schools out there, and we had them for quite a few years that we kept them. And it was the old school that I went to. We had 4 rooms for the high school. 2 rooms in the basement were grade schools, and the rest were out around. I had a lot of teachers. Some of them were very bad teachers, and some of them were very good. Mr. Robbins, Ray Robbins, was probably the best. He was kind of really a nice guy, and he probably was the best qualified teacher that they had had. They had some that were just really, I didn't think very qualified, especially the principal. He taught geometry, he taught algebra, he taught 2 or 3 classes, and there was only 2 or 3 of us that took geometry, and I had to take geometry because I'd had algebra in Caldwell. I went to Caldwell for my freshman year, and so I'd already had algebra, so I had to take geometry, and he taught it, and I didn't think he knew much about anything, but he didn't. I think then he went on, but Miss Adamson was N. Adamson's sister, and she taught there, and Georgia Anderson, who later turned out to be my sister-in-law because she married Johnny, and she was a teacher. She was a very good teacher. And at that time, they had Dick, and I can't even remember his name, and another younger guy that taught math. And they both of them were vying for Miss Adamson's attention. I thought that was kind of funny. But what else did I do? Well, I took band. I was in the band, and then I probably was the first cheerleader they ever had. They had me and Bertus Case were cheerleaders, and what I knew about cheerleading was nothing. So you can imagine that wasn't much of a cheerleader. But the student body sat on the stage of the gym, and that's where we did the cheering. And I don't know whether you remember or not, probably you don't, but then they all had just a bench along the sides, and that's where the people sat, and there wasn't much room for very many people to sit either. So no bleachers or anything like that. But this was the old school, the one they tore down and built that pie-shaped building there. Betty Turnbull was one of my very best friends, and Margaret Hennifer, who was Roy Hennifer's sister, and Lula Beacom, Bernice McLaughlin, Irene Farnsworth, and Beulah Loosely. There were, and then Bud Simpson was in my grade, and Bob Powers, and I think there was one or two more. I can't remember the boys so much, but those were the people that were there. I don't remember ever having any fun. I once told a couple, they were talking about what they did for fun and how fun they had, but they asked me what I did for fun, and I says, well, my mother died when I was 6 years old, so that was the end of my fun. I was passed from one relative to the other, and so there was, and this, if you think back, this was in the late 20s and the very early 30s, and this was a deep depression, so there was no money for fun at all, and we didn't have any. We made our own fun if we did. Horseback riding, I lived up Fish Creek for quite a while, and we'd ride horses. In fact, we rode horses to school when you went to Fish Creek. And so there was not much time for fun. It was work and no play, because it just, well, there was no play at all. I can remember when my kids, they'd have church ball and balls. My husband went to Moscow one year, but he didn't have any education either beyond high school, and he didn't have any fun either. He said it was work. When you got home you worked, and when you went to school you had to work, and so there was just no money for any fun. If you had fun, it would be skip rope, I guess, or something like that. Something that didn't cost anything. I don't know that I really had ambition. I think I would have trained for a teacher if I'd had money enough to go to school, but there was no money to go to school. No money for board and room, no money for tuition, and my dad was not working, and so there was no money, and I once thought I would like to be a pharmacist, but then, of course, there was no money for school, so I had no ambition. Then, of course, I married right out of high school. I graduated in May, and we were married in June, so I didn't have any more ambitions to go to school. I spent all of my married life right here, in this very spot. This is where every one of the houses that I had were right here. So I've been here probably more than 77 years. Well, I would advise them not to go to work, to go to school and get some sort of an education, but to look for something that will pay and something they can get a job in. Sometimes you go to school and you don't take the right things, and then you graduate and you don't have a career. You got to really look for what's going to pay and where you can get a job. Take a career that you can get a job in. But work hard, because you don't know anything when you get out of high school, even though you think you've at the end of your education and everything. You got to work really hard and do the work at the right things to get a good job. Well, it was really primitive, I tell you. We didn't have any electricity down here. South of town, we had no electricity. And we had dirt roads and everything. They had, in fact, they moved telephone poles from the middle of the street to the side 2 years after I got out of high school. And everything has changed. They didn't have a cheese factory. They didn't have they had the grocery store and just one grocery store. They didn't have any of these other fast foods things. They didn't have, they had the post office, and I worked every summer. I worked at something, and we had a cafe across the street from the post office, which is the pool hall, and then he built a extension to the pool hall and had a restaurant. And I worked as the waitress in that restaurant for 2 summers. And that's no longer, they haven't had that for years. And oh, there's a lot of things. They didn't have any motels, and they don't have much of a motel anymore. They don't have anything. But they have a lot of old houses that were around then, and they should be torn down and made new houses because they're not insulated, or they're not taken care of, and they have poor windows, and they should be torn down and fixed up so that they be better housing for people that have. But I would think that they could do something about that. Oh, I'm the most proud of my family. I have 7 children, and they all were never as poor as I was. And the grandkids all have good vocations, and they know how to work, and they know how to get along. And my great-grandchildren, I have, I think, excess of 80, and they all are very talented. I'm surprised that each family has 1 or 2 or more that are musicians, that can play the piano, play instruments, play in bands, and pretty near all of them can sing or have a singing voice. And so I'm most proud of the things that they have accomplished, because they have gone on and made good lives for themselves, far more than we ever had when we were kids, or even when I was an adult. They had far more than I ever had. One of the things I think they should have, and I know people wouldn't take it, but I think they should have some better classes for people for those kids who are not going to go on to high school, past high school. They took home ec out of the schools. You got woodworking, which is good. That gives some of those kids that don't have an ambition to go to school something else to do, something that they can use without going to school, because everybody can't go on to school. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's just that they don't want to do anything else. So if they had something else that they could do, I know they took home ec out, and home ec is the one thing that I used after I got out of school that they don't teach anymore. And it shows when you go to the grocery store, all you can see, John says, my goodness, he says, one lady has a whole grocery bag full of TV dinners, and they're not tasty at all. And where people get their taste, I don't know, because people need to know the basics of cooking and keeping house and taking care of themselves, and they don't teach things like that in school anymore. And it's something, I don't suppose anybody would even take it. But I'm saddened that they have so little music anymore. And I think that's sad that they've had to drop it, because music is really good for kids. And kids that have talent should have a place to express that talent. But if they don't have it in school, they won't get it anywhere else. Well, I can tell you a lot if you ask me a question, because I got a good memory. That's one thing I do have yet, is a good memory. But I can remember way back when I was a child, and because it was hard, really hard, when you don't have a mother or a father. My father just kind of abandoned us because he thought, well, somebody else can take care of them. And when we lived up Fish Creek when my mother died, and I just have no idea how they ever made a living up there. Jim Tilfer lived up there, and he had sheep, and so he did okay. But you had to have a few milk cows. Well, you had to be self-sustaining to live up there. You couldn't depend, because when I was 5th and 6th grade, I went to school at Fish Creek, and then you went by sleigh after it snowed, and it used to snow a lot, and the only way to get out of there was by a sleigh. And so what in the world would you do? You'd have a few cattle, and you'd have a few pigs, and I just can't imagine how they ever, because it's too cold up there to have much of a garden. We'd have carrots and stuff that would go through the summer without frost, but not much of anything else. And they used to have, everybody up there, everybody that in those days, 1930s, they could sell the cream, but they couldn't sell the milk. So they had to have pigs to drink the skim milk. And I can remember that Mrs. Patterson, Tom Patterson's wife, which is long before your time, and she used to run the creamery. And I just can't imagine how much cream you could get out of 4 or 5 cows, because that's just about all you had time to milk. You'd have to have more than one person milking if you had more cows than that. And you'd sell the cream, get $2 or $3, and that was your income. There just was nothing else. And I just can't imagine people living like that. I lived in the first house after the dam. That yellow house on the east side of the road, west side of the road. The first house up there after you pass the dam. My family owned from there clear up to where John Barton has now. My family owned that whole section there. My aunt would be my great aunt, was married to the Crooks, and that used to be what they called the Crooks' place. And in that we found in papers that they had a divorce. And for heaven's sakes, when does divorce become a common thing? And she got the ranch for some reason or another. And I can't imagine why she would get the ranch. But she got the ranch, and then she died, and my grandmother inherited it. And at that time, my grandmother and Grandma Hurst lived in Arkle, just out of Arkle. And they had cows and cattle, and my dad told me they used to trail them across the hill, because it was just, you drive to the craters, and then it's just opposite Fish Creek, and you just drove the cattle over those little hills in the spring. And that ranch would only raise grass, and I could remember very well Dad harvesting grass, hay, every year, and it was it's more wet than some places on further up, but mostly it's grass up there. And I can remember them harvesting hay, and it's just grass hay. And so my dad got part of it, and my 2 aunts got the other two parts. And so that's where we lived. It's just the first ranch up after the dam. And that yellow house used to be a pretty house, but it's still standing. It was must have been a very sturdy house because it's still standing. It's been there for probably 200 years. I went up there about 2 or 3 years ago in the fall, and that's when it was really dry, and I says, oh, that made me so blue, because I said, that isn't what it looked like when I was a kid. I can remember, well, the spring after my mother died. She died in May, and then May Memorial Day, my Aunt Hazel says, would you like to take some flowers down to your mother's grave? And oh, of course, we were just kids, and that was a good project. But I can remember going out to the meadow south of the house, and there was water up to my ankle, above my ankles. And this is in May. And there was water on the whole ranch, and there were springs everywhere. And it was, if you can't imagine water everywhere. And all of the meadows were full of water in the springtime, and you didn't hay until late July, because that'd take that long for the springs to go down and water. And we went out and gathered daisies and sunflowers and whatever else grew in there. And but after my mother died, why, my dad left the place. And he didn't have the heart to, well, nobody was there to help him, so he just let it go, and he couldn't do it all himself, so he just let it go. We had a contest that the kids went to. We used to have speech contests and one act plays, and Betty and I went down to Twin Falls, and we stayed overnight at the Richards, who used to live here in town. And because Betty didn't have anybody else to go, Mr. Robbins says I could go with her, so that she'd have some company. But Bertus Case went that. He was kind of, or a good voice anyway, and so he went. But then in April of my senior year, they had a scholastic contest in Gooding at that college that was in Gooding at that time, and it was a good college at that time. And Bud went down in, I can't remember what he went in, but I went in geometry, Betty went in English, and Margaret Hennifer went in history. And I got first in my geometry, which I thought was really funny, because we hadn't even completed the book in April. I says, who in the world? And it was Twin Falls and all those other schools. I says, somebody must have been a very poor student. In geometry, the first year, Mr. Petrosor taught it, and I didn't get a thing out of it. So I took it the next year, and of course, repeating it the next year was really good. Then I could understand it. But that was, and I took home ec, and like I said, home ec was the thing that I probably got the most good out of it, because I like to sew. I sewed long before I was even in high school. I liked to sew, and so I just did that. I made my own clothes, whatever I had, and so that's the thing that I got the most good out of high school. And the fact that I could drive. We didn't even have a car when we got married and lived down here. I'm Jean Pyrah, and I graduated from Carey High School.